Hey class, in this video I want to talk about the first couple chapters of Book 2 of the Discourses on Livy, starting with a few comments on his preface. Machiavelli begins his preface by talking about people who praise ancient times and that this is not always a good idea. That it's not always the case that ancient times are better than modern times. And it's important that he says this because you can easily get the impression from other things that Machiavelli writes that he's one of these people that thinks everything was better in antiquity than it was in his day. But Machiavelli thinks that that's not true. In fact, most people praise ancient times because they don't know the truth about it, or because they have a problem with what's going on in their life today, so they can imagine that it was better back when. But this leads Machiavelli to say that what we need to do is approach ancient times critically. We can learn from ancient history if we know how to read it correctly. And we can learn from the ancients, but our goal is ultimately going to be to improve upon the ancients, not merely to ape their style. We are able to do this because he thinks that the world has always been essentially the same. The world has not changed in any meaningful way since ancient times. Maybe we have some new toys and some new machines, but people, you and I and people like that, we're basically the same, which is to say bad. Remember, for Machiavelli, people are basically bad. We're selfish, we're lazy, until somebody or something forces us to be better. Machiavelli's goal, as he says at the end of this preface, is to try to teach us the truth about history, and in doing that, to try to teach us the truth about ourselves, because again, nothing has changed. So we are like the people that he's describing in his study of ancient history, and so that their actions, their behaviors, what makes them tick, will also shed light on us and on what makes us tick, so that we can learn from their triumphs and their mistakes and move forward. So in chapter 1 of book 2, he asks how the Romans got to be so great. And there was a tradition amongst ancient writers, and particularly Plutarch, but also Titus Livy, that it was to a certain degree a matter of luck or fortune that the Romans were able to achieve such a great empire, because they didn't have to fight any major enemies at the same time. They were always able to fight their enemies one at a time. Machiavelli says that Plutarch and Livy are wrong, and that they should not attribute Rome's success to luck, but rather to virtue. That in Machiavelli's view, the reason that the Romans didn't have to fight two wars at the same time was because they planned it that way. And in other sections of the Discourses on Livy, he explains why, and it's that the Romans would start the wars when they were ready to have them, instead of waiting for wars to come to them. In this way, they were always able to choose when to have a war, who to have the war with. There is some degree of fortune in Roman success. And this is because Machiavelli thinks that there's some degree of fortune in every success. You're never completely free of fortune. He gets into this more in the print, so I don't want to dwell on it. But essentially, it's the job of virtue to minimize the role that fortune or luck can play in your life. But it is not going to ever completely eliminate it, because in chapter 2, he talks about the different people that the Romans had to fight and how they fought them. He asks at the end of this, why is it that it seems that ancient peoples, the people that the Romans had to fight, were more firmly committed to the defense of the common good, the defense of the patria, and things like that than Machiavelli sees in his contemporaries? So he says, and this is on page 131, thinking then whence it can arise that in those ancient times people were more lovers of freedom than in these times, I believe it arises from the same cause that makes man less strong now. Well, let me stop there. Now, this might seem like he's contradicting himself, because he said numerous times that we're not that different from the ancients. But now he's saying we're less strong now, and we don't love freedom as much now as they did in ancient times. So what we have to look for is the explanation, right? And his explanation is not going to be something internal to us, but rather something external that has happened. There are sort of like socio-cultural influences that make us less strong now. And the implication is if we could throw off those influences or change them, we would be stronger. So what are those influences? He says, the difference between our education and the ancient, which is founded on the difference between our religion and the ancient. So we might say to Machiavelli, since you keep telling us that we're not different from the ancients and we can achieve all the things that they achieved, how are you now saying that we're weaker? Well, as we read forward, we see that it's because of a difference in our education. Education, or educazione, is a really important word for Machiavelli, and it goes beyond just schooling, but it means the general way people are taught to look at the world by not just their schools, but the modes and orders of the society that they live under, right? So societies or cities, communities have different modes and orders, and those modes and orders have a function of educating the citizens to behave in certain ways. So the education of the modes and orders that we live under now is different from the education that was received under the modes and orders of, say, ancient Rome. Ancient Rome has different modes and orders than modern day, and because of that, they have different educations. But why do we have different modes and orders? Well, Machiavelli is going to say that it's because of a difference in religion. He says, our religion, by that he means Christianity, he's writing in Italy, says, our religion, having shown the truth in the true way, makes us esteem less the honor of the world, whereas the Gentiles, that'd be like the ancient Romans, esteeming it very much and having placed the highest good in it, were more ferocious in their actions. And this can be inferred from many of their institutions. And a little farther down, he says, besides this, the ancient religion did not beatify men if they were not full of worldly glory, as were captains of armies or princes of republics. Our religion has glorified humble and contemplative more than active men. It has placed the highest good in humility, abjectness, contempt of things human. The other, the ancient religion, placed it in greatness of spirit, strength of body, and all other things capable of making men very strong. Right? So Machiavelli's ultimate point is that the source of the difference in the educazione of the ancients and his contemporaries is a different view of the highest good. And although he's talking about religion, this view goes further than that, right? It includes things that we might consider philosophical or political. Whatever a society or a community, so what is the highest good? The highest good is whatever one thinks is the ultimate end or goal of human life, right? There might be lots of things that are good, but there's one thing that is the highest good, is the best good, is the most important thing. And whatever a community views as the most important thing will be reflected in their modes and orders, which will in turn be reflected in the educazione that is imparted to its citizens. And so Machiavelli says that the ancients, the ancient Romans in particular, they thought that the highest good was glory, strength, conquest. That was reflected in their modes and orders and imparted to their citizens in the education that the city provided. He says, our city has a different view of the highest good. For us, the highest good is to go to heaven. And one gets to heaven by being humble, by being forgiving, and because of this, our modes and orders teach us to value different things. It produces a different education. Machiavelli says, the collectivity of men, right, so he's talking about people in Italy in his day, so as to go to paradise, think more of enduring their beatings than of avenging them. People in his day are told that you should turn the other cheek. No ancient Roman would turn the other cheek. Ultimately, a different view of the highest good causes a different view of modes and orders, and therefore different education, which produces different kinds of citizens. And Machiavelli's point is that when we are looking at a city or a community and trying to figure out why it acts this way or that way, or why its people tend to act this way or that way, we should think about, well, what do they hold up as their highest good? Or, conversely, by looking at how citizens or people living in that community act, we can discern what the modes and orders are of that community and what view of the highest good is imparted by those modes and orders. And so Machiavelli is here being quite critical of sort of the religious ethics of his day, but it's important to understand not just religious ethics, also the sorts of things that we see in Socrates. Socrates sort of passively accepts his punishment and stays in jail rather than escaping. That seems to be something that Machiavelli would not approve of. And so the takeaway from this is not, oh, well, Machiavelli likes this religion but doesn't like that religion. The takeaway is that Machiavelli thinks that different cities have different views of the highest good baked into their modes and orders, which influences the education that the residents receive, which in turn produces different kinds of people, and that in turn produces different kinds of results on the, when in competition with other cities and things. So in chapter 5, Machiavelli is going to explain another reason why we don't understand our histories. And it has to do with sort of civilizational collapses due to natural disasters and things like that that might wipe out a city, wipe out its libraries, wipe out its historical records, and sort of people have to start from scratch. So chapter 5 begins with a reference to this theory of the eternity of the world. And this is a theory that in Machiavelli's time would have been associated with a group of philosophers known as the Latin Averroists. The Latin Averroists were philosophers who wrote in Latin, hence the Latin part of the title, who were very influenced by their interpretation of a philosopher named Ibn Rushd, whose name went into Latin as Averroes. Before I start telling you what the Latin Averroists thought Ibn Rushd taught, I should mention that there is some thought among scholars that they may have misinterpreted him for reasons that I'll get into shortly. So Averroes was a philosopher who lived in southern Spain in about the 10th or 11th century, wrote in Arabic, and produced some very, very influential commentaries on Aristotle. Averroes' commentaries on Aristotle were translated from the Arabic into Latin in the late 12th and into the 13th century, and that created this school of philosophers known as the Latin Averroists, who essentially adopted Averroes' interpretation of Aristotle. Averroes' commentaries were strict commentaries solely on Aristotle, but they seem to assert the superiority of philosophical analysis to religious belief. Now, this is where some modern scholars will say that that wasn't an accurate reading of what Averroes was up to, and if the Latin Averroists had read some of Averroes' other works, they would have known this, but they didn't, and frankly, it doesn't really matter whether or not they got Averroes right for our purposes. For our purposes, what matters is that the Latin Averroists thought that Averroes was asserting the superiority of philosophical analysis to religious belief for a variety of reasons that can be found in his commentaries on Aristotle, and they thought that this was essentially the correct way to go. Now, one of the places where this played out is in the debate that began surrounding how long the Earth has existed. Now, you have to keep in mind this is sort of pre-modern science, right? They didn't have the Big Bang Theory or the Hubble Space Telescope or anything like that. When they were trying to figure out the age of the world, they didn't have a lot of data to go on. According to the Latin Averroists, based on everything we can tell from philosophy and our own observations, the world has always existed and will always exist, right? And that is the eternity of the world thesis. So according to the Latin Averroists, there is never a time when there is not a world, and there will never be a time when there's not a world. The world always exists. Okay, so why is that a big deal? Well, that is in sharp contrast with the creation stories of the Abrahamic religions, right? Islam, Judaism, Christianity. They all assert that at some point God created the earth. And so the Latin Averroists said when we have this contradiction between what we know from philosophy, or at least what we think we know from philosophy, and what religious belief tells us, the philosophical view, insofar as we're philosophers, is superior. So insofar as I'm a philosopher, I'm going to believe that the world is eternal. Now, I'm giving a real superficial version of this, that if this was a course on medieval philosophy, we could really take a deep dive into it. But for now, what we need to know is that that's what's going to come into readers' minds when Machiavelli starts talking about the eternity of the world. It seems like Machiavelli in the beginning of the chapter is disagreeing with the thesis of the eternity of the world. As the chapter goes on, and you'll see when you read it, he's actually sort of backhandedly agreeing with it. Because what he's saying is, well, here are some reasons why we might say that the world's not eternal. And then he goes through and shows why each one of those reasons is wrong. So Machiavelli essentially believes in the eternity of the world. Why is this important? One, it puts him on sort of the Latin Averroist philosopher side rather than the religious belief side. And that ties into his belief that we talked about earlier about the highest good, right? He thinks that the problem with religion is that it teaches that the highest good is going to be found somewhere outside the world, right? In paradise, in heaven. And Machiavelli thinks that the reason the ancient Romans were able to conquer was because they believed that the highest good was in this world. So if the world is eternal, then the highest good would have to be in this world, right? There would be no outside of the world. Right, so the eternity of the world thesis in Machiavelli functions to reinforce the idea that the highest good is in the world. This might be a little abstract, but to boil it down, what we get from these first couple chapters of Book 2 is the closest thing we get to sort of Machiavelli's metaphysics. And his metaphysics is one where there is nothing outside the visible physical world that we live in. There is only the world. The world has essentially been here forever, and nothing has really changed, right? We're still exactly the way we were thousands of years ago. The only thing that has changed is our education. And if we had a better education, then we could get better results. And the key to the better education, sort of the educational reform that Machiavelli wants to accomplish, is to change our view of the highest good. He wants us to view the highest good as something we achieve in this world, not as something to be achieved outside of the world. Now, you may agree with that or you may disagree with that. You may be like, yeah, heck yeah, Machiavelli, you got it figured out. Or you may think, oh man, this guy, I don't like where he's going with this. Either one is fine. You don't have to agree with Machiavelli on this. The important thing is to just understand where he's coming from and why he's saying that, because he's hugely influential in the development of modern philosophy.